This is Letter from America. Today's topic is the year 2022 was annus horribilis, or year of disaster for Zimbabwe. The year 2022 is ending on a very sour note for Zimbabweans. It was literally a dark time for Zimbabweans, given power outages that affected and still affect businesses and families. Practically all commentators, except for the government propagandists and apologists, are agreed that 2022 was annus horribilis, or a year of disaster or misfortune. A number of leading economists gave very accurate projections at the beginning of the year that Zimbabwe's economy is badly mismanaged and will go down even further at the end of the year. The online publication, Zimbabwe Independent, gave a chilling summary of the situation in the country as the year 2020 comes to an end. The publication's big, bold, and screaming headline read, "Hospitals crumble as blackouts mount. Constitutional rights are violated. Intensive care units in patients are placed in grave danger." That was a big, bold headline that told the story of the situation in Zimbabwe in 2022. Dr. Prosper Chitambara, a development economist based in Harare, summed up the state of the economy in 2022. Writing in the online publication Zimbabwe Independent, Dr. Chitambara said the year 2022 has been a difficult year for the country economically on account of several external and internal factors. The economy continues, he wrote, to face structural challenges that include chronic high inflation, erratic growth pattern, high levels of informality, a huge competitiveness gap, inadequate infrastructure, weak institutions, challenging doing business environment, high levels of public indebtedness, high inequalities, high levels of food insecurity, and high levels of poverty. Dr. Chitambara wrote, the annual inflation rate rose from 60.61% in January 2022 to 191.6% in June and 268.8% in October. It slowed down a little to 255% in November, but nevertheless it remains the highest annual inflation rate in the world. Just for comparison, Sudan's October annual inflation rate was 102.6%. For Lebanon, it was 158.46%, and Venezuela 155.80%. Those are countries with very high inflation rates, but their inflation rates come nowhere near that of Zimbabwe. In Zambia, annual inflation rate in November 2022 was 9.8%. In South Africa, it was 70.7.6%, and in Botswana it was 13.1%. So you can see here that inflation in the SADC region is under control, except in Zimbabwe. According to the 2022 edition of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development World Investment Report, foreign direct investment inflows into Zimbabwe stood at a mere $66 million in 2021, and that was down from $194 million in 2020, $280 million in 2019, and a whopping $745 million in 2018. Just imagine that. Only 4 years ago, foreign direct investment inflows in 2018 amounted to $745 million. But in 2021, that went all the way down to $66 million. The country remains in debt distress, with total public and publicly guaranteed debt amounting to $17.6 billion US as at the end of September 2022. And this is up from 17.2 billion as at the end of December 2021. Unlike other SADC countries, Zimbabwe has not been able to renegotiate its debts. In a remarkable contrast, Zambia's president Hakainde Hichilema secured billions of dollars of investments each time he went abroad, like to Glasgow for the climate change conference and to Washington for the US-Africa summit. The Mnangagwa, Zimbabwe's ZANU president, also went abroad on some of these conferences. He came back empty-handed. A combination of the increase in the bank policy rate from 80% to 200% with the effect from June 27, the introduction of gold coins, and value for money audits to enhance the efficiency of public spending and plug leakages in public procurement have actually contributed to the slowdown in both monthly and annual inflation being experienced in the economy over the past few months. Another leading economist, Professor Gift Mugano, a renowned economist in Zimbabwe, said nearly half the country's population is living in abject poverty since the November 2017 coup, which toppled the late Robert Mugabe. This poverty rate has doubled since Mnangagwa took over as president. Professor Mugano said in an interview that in 2018, 29% or one-third of Zimbabweans were living in extreme poverty. But today, 4 years later under the Mnangagwa government, 49% or nearly half of the Zimbabweans now live in extreme poverty. Other records indicate that in the 42 years ZANU-PF has been in power, an estimated 70% of Zimbabweans now live in poverty. Virtually the entire population now survives on the informal economy. Professor Mugano also said Mnangagwa and his finance minister Mthuli Ncube, as well as the ZANU-PF leadership, Do not take advice from economists. The highly publicized meetings between government and industry representatives is a false narrative aimed at giving the misleading impression that government is listening to stakeholders, Professor Mugano said. He said this is totally false. He said government economic policies are not based on inputs from stakeholders, but decisions within ZANU-PF apparatchiki or top officials. The Transitional Stabilization Plan that was launched in 2018 was a 300-page document that Mthuli brought with him from his home base in Switzerland. It was not a product of stakeholders' consultation and input. It was never made available for review or consultation, but was implemented immediately, Professor Mugano said. A number of economists criticized Mthuli Ncube for imposing the plan without local input or taking local conditions into consideration. Today, the results of this plan are a clear evidence of the plan's abject failure to achieve its intended objectives to supposedly stabilize the dollar. In the 4 years the Mthuli's plan has been enacted, inflation for 2020 shot up by 800%. In 2018, 29% of Zimbabweans were in poverty, but now the figure has doubled to 49%, Professor Mugano said. The vast majority of workers now live below poverty datum line or PDL. Zimbabwe was in 2018 a mid-income lower class country. Today, Zimbabwe is below mid-income level. And all of this has happened during Ncube's Transitional Stabilization Plan. Domestic debt spiraled to 20 billion US dollars, and this is double what it was 4 years ago. Professor Mugano projected this debt will double in 3 years. Some economists estimate the real debt to be double this figure by the end of 2022. To make matters worse, Zimbabweans do not know where this debt was acquired from and what it was used for. The bottom line is Mnangagwa and ZANU-PF government have failed dismally to run and manage Zimbabwe's economy. The solution, Professor Mugano simply said, is simply time to change government. ZANU-PF has been in government since 1980, that is 42 years ago. And look at the state of Zimbabwe today. SADC countries have had several presidents since independence, but Zimbabwe has had only one until 2017. And Mugabe's successor, Mnangagwa, is even worse. And Professor Mugano listed the failures of the plan by pointing to an economy that he said is in dire straits. The chronic high inflationary environment continues to erode real incomes. The proportion of the working poor has increased markedly, with average salaries lagging far behind the poverty datum line or PDL. Dr. Chitambara, another economist, said the average minimum wage in Zimbabwe as at November 22, 2022 was about 131 to 155 US dollars at the prevailing exchange rates. Compare that to South Africa. According to the quarterly employment statistics for June 2022, the average earnings, monthly earnings in South Africa stand at 1,586 by May 2022. Compare 1,586 in South Africa to $131 in Zimbabwe. The difference couldn't be greater than this. The country, Zimbabwe that is, has been experiencing an erratic and skewed growth pattern. Growth has not been fast and inclusive enough to absorb the growing working age population and to have a significant poverty reduction impact, Dr. Chitambara said. The reality of the economic situation in Zimbabwe is the country now has an informal economy. Unemployment in the formal economy stands at 95%. Only 5% of Zimbabweans are employed in the formal economy. To put it simply and very painfully, almost everyone in Zimbabwe is a vendor. Even university graduates are vending, selling airtime, selling tomatoes, selling fruits, selling second-hand clothing just to survive. Dr. Chitambara wrote, the structure of the economy in Zimbabwe has contributed to the high levels of poverty and inequality in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has a dual and enclave economy with a small formal economy existing in juxtaposition with a predominant informal economy. Most of the labor force is employed in the informal economy. Informal employment has continued to increase from 75.6% in 2019 to 88% in 2022 during the second quarter. Informal employment is often characterized by lower productivity, lower pay, limited social protection coverage, high levels of working poverty, and poor working conditions in general. Dr. Chitambara added, the lack of sufficient, full, productive, and decent jobs is complicating efforts to end poverty in Zimbabwe. Estimates from the World Bank show that the number of extremely poor Zimbabweans reached 7.9 million, almost 49% of the population in 2020, up from 42% in 2019. Inequality is also on the rise. According to the statistics from Zimstat, the Gini index rose from 44.7% in 2017 to 50.4% in 2019. The richest 10% of the Zimbabwean population consume 40% of the total national consumption. The poorest 10% only consume 2% of the total national consumption. Those contrasts between the rich and the poor are simply too great. Dr. Chitambara added, a combination of the below average 2021-2022 agricultural crop production and the macroeconomic instability typified by chronic high inflation have exacerbated food insecurity within the country. According to the World Food Programme Hunger Map, the number of estimated people with insufficient food consumption has increased from 5.4 million in the first week of July 2022 to 5.6 million during the third week of September 2022 and 5.9 million during the second week of December. According to the World Bank Food Security Update, Zimbabwe had the highest nominal annual food price inflation at 321% in October 2022. This was up from 65.4% in November 2021. The high public debt represents an impediment to sustainable economic growth and employment creation in the economy. The huge debt stock has reduced the availability of both local and external resources for health-related investments. The cost of servicing the debt continues to crowd out fiscal resources that could have been invested in critical social services such as healthcare and education. As a result, government spending on critical sectors such as health remains relatively low. Dr. Chitambara said key state institutions remain weak and in urgent need of reform. In particular, state-owned enterprises and parastatals are facing financial difficulties with mounting losses and negative equity, which raise fiscal risks. According to the IMF Article 4 consultation report of April 2022, the state-owned enterprises and parastatal sectors accumulated losses of about 5% of the gross domestic product between 2011 and 2018. And the government has subsidized these state-owned enterprises through cash transfers, equity injections, debt assumptions, and loans worth an estimated 11% of the GDP. Another very troubling issue is the maternity mortality ratio, or MMR. It was higher in rural areas, 402 deaths per 100,000 live births, than in urban areas, 298 per 100,000 live births. Yes, there was a decline in maternal mortality ratio, but the ratio is still unsustainably high, Dr. Chitambara wrote. This high ratio is attributable to a number of factors that include failure to access antenatal services, delays in reaching healthcare facilities owing to poor public transport system in some areas, inadequate public healthcare financing, human resource challenges, and refusal to use modern medicine in some communities owing to religious and traditional attitudes. Zimbabwe has a long way to go to meet the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals target of 70 deaths per 100,000 live births by the year 2030. Writing in The Independent, an online publication, Freeman Makopa says health civil rights campaigners have warned of grave consequences to patients on life support in hospitals as the rolling power blackouts mount. The constitutional rights of patients have been violated as blackouts stifled access to health services. And the Media and Dental Private Practitioners Association of Zimbabwe's president, Johannes Marisa, says Zimbabwe is in the grip of a severe health crisis. Rolling power cuts have affected Zimbabwe since last month, when the Zambezi River Authority ordered power utility ZESA Holdings to shut down the Kariba hydroelectric power plant on the Zambezi River until January. Under the fresh wave of blackouts, Zimbabweans have had to endure up to 19 hours daily without power. The Kariba hydroelectric power plant, which the ZRA once mothballed, has been producing 60% of the country's power requirements after undergoing $550 million facelift in 2018. Pressure has been exerted on the facility after 920 megawatts Hwange thermal power station has been hit by breakdowns. A $1.5 billion upgrade current underway at the facility was due for completion last month, but there has been no word about when it will come online. According again to the World Bank report, Zimbabwe's economic development continues to be hampered by price and exchange rate instability, the misallocation of productive resources, low investment, and limited structural transformation. High inflation, multiple exchange rates, unsustainable debt levels, and the ineffective control of public spending have increased the cost of production, reduced incentives for productivity enhancing investment, and encouraged informality. Trade integration has declined, and foreign direct investment remains very low, limiting the transfer of new technologies and investment in modernizing the economy. The World Bank report continues. Unsustainable debt levels and long-standing arrears to international financial institutions limit the country's potential for growth. External debt is estimated at 76% of gross domestic product in 2022. Over 70% of the debt is in arrears, constraining the access to concessional finance needed to support productive investment. Against this, the government has prepared an arrears clearance debt relief and restructuring strategy and resumed token payments to international financial institutions and the Paris Club creditors. To compound Zimbabwe's economic problems, ZANU-PF regime is engaged in a pandemic of corruption, costing the country more than $2 billion a year. Government recently splashed millions of dollars giving loans to ministers and MPs. The big question is, where will it all end? Are Zimbabweans increasingly being made poor to the extent that they have become object of political manipulation by the rich ZANU-PF elite? What happens when Zimbabweans are pressed hard against the wall of poverty? Will they feel enough is enough? We must fight back? Or will Zimbabweans die like poor sheep sent to slaughter? More than 100 years ago, Karl Marx, the founder of communism and Marxism, argued that when the poor are continually oppressed, they will reach a stage that some people call proletarianization. This is the stage where people feel they have suffered enough and that they have nothing to lose except the chains that enslave them. It is at this stage Karl Marx predicted that the poor will rise in mass protests and overthrow their oppressors. Have Zimbabweans reached this stage where they feel enough is enough? Zvakwana, sokwanele, kusi kufa ndokupi. The ball is in the Zimbabweans' court. It is their turn to end their oppression. Otherwise, 2023 will be even worse for them unless Zimbabweans act decisively. ZANU-PF may deceive itself into thinking that its use of violence will keep the Zimbabweans under control forever. But the fact of the matter is that ZANU-PF is actually carrying seeds of its own destruction. Corruption, violence, looting of state resources, those are seeds of ZANU-PF's destruction. The United States President Abraham Lincoln made a famous statement about governments that lived on fooling and deceiving people, the way ZANU-PF is fooling and deceiving Zimbabweans. This is what Abraham Lincoln said. You can fool some people all the time. You can also fool all people some of the time, but you can never fool all the people all the time. And the Zimbabweans have a very wise saying too, Ridemanjanga hariputirwe, which means that the truth will eventually come out, no matter how much you try to hide it. If a mass demonstration breaks out against ZANU-PF, these Desiree Pachinoans will have no one to blame but themselves. And the ZANU-PF Central Committee report has made that clear. The party has lost the support of the Zimbabweans because the party is trying to fool everybody all the time. Something completely impossible, as Abraham Lincoln once said.
This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you for listening. This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you for listening. This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you for listening. This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis